Hello and welcome to the Special Education Finance Fiscal Monitoring Training for the 20 to 21 school year. My name is Audrey Forbes and I am on the DESE Special Education Unit's Funding and Finance team. In today's training, we're going to cover an overview of the fiscal monitoring process, important deadlines throughout the process, how to complete the fiscal risk assessment, how to complete monitoring protocol worksheets, and finally, we'll end with several resources that can help you through this process. The ADE Special Education Unit has established a risk-based process for fiscal monitoring that is designed to ensure LEAs comply with fiscal requirements applicable to IDEA Part B and to the Uniform Grants Guidance. This process is implemented according to risk factors identified through a variety of sources, including grant applications and other information submitted to and reviewed by ADE SEU. Fiscal monitoring occurs on a 4-year cycle that aligns with the Special Education Program monitoring cycle. The purpose of this monitoring is to support your district in its efforts to maintain compliance with state and federal regulations and improve outcomes for students with disabilities. The fiscal monitoring process includes a special education unit review of data, a self-assessment that allows staff to complete a comprehensive review of their own fiscal data and self-identify both their strengths and their needs, and a worksheet of questions regarding the LEA's use of 6B funds. If after this training you have any questions about the fiscal monitoring process, you can access the Special Education Fiscal Accountability Procedures Manual at this link, and of course, please feel free to contact our office with any questions you may have. Fiscal monitoring will follow the same timeline as the Special Education Program monitoring. You should have received a letter specifying which of the 2 time frames your school district will be monitored in. This timeline is a broad overview of what to expect during fiscal monitoring. We'll talk about each of these sections in more detail later in the presentation. Every school district is required to complete the Fiscal Risk Assessment, which is a self-assessment completed in MySped by the LEA. This assessment is due November 13th, 2020 if you are in time frame 1, and due February 12th, 2021 if you are in time frame 2. Our finance team will then review the completed risk assessments and send letters to LEAs to inform them of which tier they fall in. These letters will be sent no later than December 4th, 2020 if you are in time frame 1, and no later than March 5th, 2021 if you're in time frame 2. For LEAs who are in Tier 1, this will conclude their fiscal monitoring for the year. For LEAs who are in Tier 2 or 3, SPED Finance will send an email to the LEA requesting additional documentation. This email will be sent by December 11th, 2020 for districts in time frame 1, and by March 12th, 2021 for districts in time frame 2. The LEA will then have 30 calendar days to submit all requested documentation. Fiscal monitoring conclusion letters or corrective action plans will be mailed out as LEAs conclude their monitoring requirements and as SPED Finance reviews submitted documentation. The first step in the monitoring process is the risk assessment. The purpose of the risk assessment is to determine the risk in regard to how the LEA uses the Title 6B grant. The risk assessment is broken up into 2 sections, the Special Education Unit Review of Data and the LEA Fiscal Risk Assessment, which is a self-assessment completed in MySped by the LEA. The self-assessment should be completed by November 13th, 2020 if you are in time frame 1, and by February 12th, 2021 if you're in time frame 2. Both the SEU Review of Data and the LEA Fiscal Risk Assessment are taken into account when scoring the total risk assessment. If at any point during the monitoring process you would like to view the LEA self-assessment questions or see how the risk assessment is scored, you can find them on the Special Education Unit's Funding and Finance page by following this link. The first section of the risk assessment is the SEU Review of Data. Within this section, there are 6 areas that will be reviewed based on information we already have on file with the SPED Finance Office. This information, tracked over the past 4 years, will factor into the depth that the SPED Finance Office reviews your district. The LEA will not be required to provide information for this section of the assessment unless otherwise stated by the SPED Finance Office. The second section is the Fiscal Risk Assessment. Again, this is the self-assessment completed by each LEA in MySPED. To start the assessment, log into your district's MySPED account by following this link. Click on the Finance tab and select Fiscal Risk Assessment at the bottom of the drop-down box. From there, you'll be taken to the first page of the assessment. Make sure you enter your district's LEA number before beginning. For the rest of the assessment, click Next to go to the next page. All of the questions on the Fiscal Risk Assessment are yes or no questions, and there are 17 questions total. When you reach the end, be sure to click Submit so that the SPED Finance Office will receive your Fiscal Risk Assessment. At this point, the LEA has completed the first part of the fiscal monitoring process. The SPED Finance team will contact each LEA independently to let them know the next step of the process. Once the Fiscal Risk Assessment is submitted, the SPED Finance team will review and score the assessment. This assessment, along with the 6 areas we reviewed earlier in the SEU Review of Data section, will comprise the Total Risk Assessment. The scoring rubric includes 3 tiers. Tier 1 is considered low risk. Tier 2 is considered medium risk. Finally, Tier 3 is considered high risk. Once your risk assessment is scored, SPED Finance will notify the district by letter of which tier they fall in. The SEU will also let the LEA know if any additional information is needed from the district. If you would like to score your own assessment, a copy of the SPED Finance Scoring Rubric is available on the Special Education Unit's Funding and Finance page at this link. This is not required. This is just a resource we provide in case you would like to know your score before your notification letter reaches you. Once your district receives the notification letter from SPED Finance with your assigned tier, that completes the risk assessment portion of the fiscal monitoring process, and we'll move on into the next step. The next step of the process is monitoring protocols. These protocols are a set of questions in 6 different areas about the LEA's use of funds. For Tier 1 districts who scored a 1 to 10 on their risk assessment, the fiscal monitoring process concludes here. Tier 1 districts are not required to complete this set of questions. Tier 2 districts who scored a 10 to 20 on their risk assessment will be required to complete questions identified by SPED Finance and submit documentation to support their answers. Tier 3 districts who scored a 20 to 40 on their risk assessment will be required to complete all of the monitoring protocol questions and provide documentation to support their answers. If at any time during the fiscal monitoring process you would like to view the monitoring protocol questions, you can find them on the SPED Funding and Finance page at this link. There are 6 sections in the monitoring protocols: obligation or liquidation and use of funds. These questions focus on allowable expenditures, which we'll cover a little bit later in the presentation. Maintenance of effort and excess cost. These questions focus on if the district met MOE and if exceptions were used. Personnel, which covers staff funded from the 6B grant. Contractual service, which includes procurement and private providers. Equipment and construction, and other expenditures, which includes CCEIS, CEIS, and attorney fees. There will be questions on the monitoring protocol worksheet for both the LEA and SPED Finance to answer. If you're following along on the worksheet, the documentation in gray boxes will be pulled by the SPED Finance team. The documentation in blue boxes will be provided by the LEA. Now let's go over some of the commonly asked questions we get about the monitoring protocol. If you're following along with the protocol worksheet, Protocol Question 3 asks about allowable expenditures. SPED Finance will pull the required data in-house, but LEAs should be aware that we may request additional documentation, such as copies of expenditures, itemized receipts, or purchase orders. We'll cover expenditure audit trails and non-allowable expenditures a little later in the presentation. Now let's skip to question 10 on the protocol worksheet, which asks about IDEA funds. For this question, the LEA will be required to submit monthly time certification forms with full-time equivalent, or FTE, noted at the top of the forms. A sample time certification form can be found at this link on the SPED Funding and Finance page under Finance Forms. It's also important to note that we'll need a time certification form with signatures for each month. Questions 11 through 15 on the Monitoring Protocols worksheet cover contractual services, which includes procurement. Here are a few points to consider when answering these questions. It is important to remember that specific contract terms may need to be included depending on the type of contract. LEAs cannot contract with parties that have been debarred or suspended. In addition, all contracts must be for a period of no more than 1 year and must include a termination clause. LEAs are expected to have procedures in effect to ensure that contractors meet the terms of their agreements and must maintain documented internal controls to this effect. More information on contracts can be found by following this link to the Special Education Fiscal Accountability Procedures Manual on pages 10 through 20. Let's talk about expenditure audit trails. When the DESE SPED Finance team reviews audit trails, there are a few types of expenditures that may require the LEA to provide additional documentation, which may include copies of checks, purchase orders, itemized receipts, lesson plans, or portions of students' IEPs. Here are some common red flags that we see when reviewing expenditure audit trails. First, we often see reimbursements to individual staff members for supplies, and often LEAs will include a note that says the payment was indeed a reimbursement. In these instances, the LEA may be asked to submit a copy of the itemized receipt and purchase order. Second, we often see that the vendor name on the audit trail is the name of a bank card or credit card along with a generic description such as office supplies, classroom supplies, and sometimes just supplies. In this instance, we'll need the LEA to submit a copy of the itemized receipt and purchase order to SPED Finance. Third, vendors like Amazon and Walmart have a broad array of inventory. Purchases from vendors such as these may require the LEA to submit a copy of the itemized receipt and purchase order to SPED Finance. Vendors such as grocery stores may also require the submission of an itemized receipt and purchase order. Purchasing supplies to complete a cooking activity that aligns with a student's IEP goals or objectives is an allowable expense, and the LEA may be required to submit evidence through lesson plans, behavior plans, or the student's IEP that show food purchases are for educational purposes. Purchasing food for a staff meeting is not allowable. Expenditures of $1,000 or more spent on equipment and technology or out-of-state travel will result in a review to see if the school district filed an approval request form with the SPED Finance Office. If the district did not complete approval paperwork prior to these purchases, the district will receive a corrective action plan, also known as a CAP, for these areas to address the district's policies and procedures in the future. There are several non-allowable expenditures for 6B funds. If any of these items were purchased with 6B funds, The SPED Finance Office will request justification for the purchases, and the school district may be required to pay back the cost of these items. The most common non-allowable expenditures our office sees on audit trails are food, field trips, and Special Olympics expenses. If you have a purchase that you would like to make and you're unsure if it is an allowable expense for 6B funds, when in doubt, don't make that purchase with 6B funds. Or give our office a call and we'll be happy to let you know if that expense is indeed allowable. Some items could be considered non-allowable unless they are justified. If a district offers students recreational services, including therapeutic recreation, such as equine therapy, the district needs to ensure that the recreation supports the need of a student. Districts should explain the student's individual need for the service. This should be identified in the PLAF of the student's IEP. It should also be addressed in the Related Services section of the IEP and include the time, frequency, and setting. We mentioned groceries previously in the presentation. Groceries can be an allowable expenditure as long as any food purchased is tied to a student's IEP needs, as addressed in the PLAF, and are a part of goals, objectives, or a transition plan. It could also be outlined as part of a behavior plan or as positive reinforcement. It's also important to note that positive reinforcements are meant to be small portions or short-term, such as one M&M. Districts who have cleared the fiscal monitoring process will receive a conclusion letter from SPED Finance. Districts who were found to have unjustified, non-allowable expenditures with 6B funds will be issued a corrective action plan, known as a CAP. The CAP points out areas of non-compliance and outlines actions the district must take as a result, such as reviewing financial policies and procedures with staff or paying back the cost of non-allowable expenditures. Once the district completes the actions outlined in the CAP and submits evidence that the steps were completed, the district will clear the fiscal monitoring process. Here are a few resources that you can reference throughout the fiscal monitoring process. In addition to the Special Education Fiscal Accountability Procedures Manual and the SPED Funding and Finance page, which we've referenced throughout today's presentation, there is also information about contracts on the IRS website. Information on Arkansas Medicaid in the schools can be found on the DESE website. Of course, if you have any questions or need help during the fiscal monitoring process, please feel free to contact our office. We are happy to help with any questions you may have. We look forward to working with you this year and thank you for your time today.